Hello, Uriel from Ninja Bear Studio here. Welcome back. In this video, we'll talk about creating melee attacks, which is a natural progression since we just finished configuring our weapons. We will take a look at the melee scan functionality, including how to configure the animations. We'll take a look at the attack ability that can be used to create melee and ranged attacks. We will take a look at gameplay effects provided by the combat system, and then finally adding the abilities and the configuration of input so we can activate the attacks. In the engine, we'll start by going to our weapon blueprint created in the last video. At this stage, it might be useful to set all collisions from the mesh to overlap. This can give us some certainty that only the melee scans will collide with the targets. Of course, those can be reverted back once we're done with the configuration. Now let's open the actual weapon mesh for our sword. As you can see, there are 3 sockets across the blade. Their names are very important, especially the prefix, because it will be used later when we are configuring the melee scan. You can adjust the positions as necessary. And another thing, I removed the collisions from the mesh itself. Now let's repeat the same steps in our other weapon, the shield. Once again, all the collisions are set to overlap, and as for the mesh, I only have 1 socket now. This is because for the shield, I'm not gonna use line traces. Instead, I will use a box sweep. The same as before, the shield also does not have mesh collisions. Now let's move on to the animations. For melee attacks, we want to use the melee scan notify state. This notify should cover parts of the animation where the melee scan should happen. Also, for now, don't worry too much about the other ones, such as the combo or motion warping. We'll talk about those soon. The melee scan has a few properties that we should familiarize ourselves with. The first one being the source. It could be the owner or the weapon. Owner means the melee scan will happen from the combatant's mesh, and it's used to represent attacks such as punches, kicks, or even attacks where your weapon is attached to the mesh, like the Paragon characters, for example. As for weapons, that means blueprints that are assigned to the weapon manager, which is precisely what we've done in the previous video. In this case, I can search for weapons using a gameplay tag query. In this scan, I'm looking for inventory, item, type, sword, which is exactly the gameplay tag assigned to the sword in the previous video. Next, I have the prefix for my scan sockets. In this case, we have 3 in our sword mesh, and since their names start with scan, they will all be used by the melee scan. Our next property is the scan channel, which we will set to weapon. This is the collision channel that we created during the configuration of Ninja Combat. Scan mode allows us to define what type of scan we want to perform. For this blade, we will create a line trace, but later on we'll check a different one for the shield. And finally, during our last video, we configured some weapon trails for the blade, so we can enable weapon trails here. Trail systems will usually expose parameters used to update their positions. You can adjust the parameter names if you need in the fields down below. This should be all for this animation montage, so let's open the next one. Once again, we have a few notifies here, but we will focus only in the melee scan for now. Once again, the scan starts from the weapon, but this time the query is set to search for the shield in the weapon manager. Moving on to the scan mode, we will do a box sweep this time, and we will try to mimic the shield's dimensions. So here we have 30 units for width, 40 units for height, and 5 units for depth. Later, when the ability is done, we will be able to fine-tune these dimensions if necessary. With both animations done, we can move on to the gameplay abilities. First, it's important to mention that all attack abilities will inherit from combat ability attack. This ability can support both melee and ranged attacks. For the combat melee damage effect, I will use combat effect melee hit. I'll set the first animation montage that we checked in this video, disable motion warping, and enable debug. For the activation tags, right now I'm gonna use ability combo, but I have another one that will be useful later on when we're actually configuring the combo. Feel free to add other gameplay tags to block the activation of other abilities or even this one. The next ability is the secondary attack, with the shield, and it's very similar. It's also a subclass of combat ability attack, but we will set a different melee damage effect class in this one. Everything else is very similar. Setting the animation montage, disabling motion warping, enabling debug, but now here's the difference. This ability has a cost. As for the tags, same as before. An activation tag that we'll use in our input handler, plus other tags to block the activation. Now let's take a look at the gameplay effects, starting with the damage one. This effect has a parent class of combat effect melee hit, which provides some initial elements like the gameplay tags, gameplay effect components, and most importantly, the damage execution calculation class. So back to the tags, I'm adding a knockback gameplay tag. Later on, the hit reaction will identify this tag as a heavy attack. And then down below, in the execution, I'm adding a modifier to the combat data damage multiplier exposed by the damage execution calculation class. In this particular case, I am multiplying the damage by 1.5, and keep in mind that in here we could use an attribute or a curve table as well. As for the cost effect, that is just a gameplay effect. In this one, I am simply subtracting a value from the stamina attribute, and once again, this could be yet another attribute or a curve-based value. And I am adding a gameplay effect component that allows me to add yet another gameplay effect whenever this one is applied. In this case, I will add the cancel stamina regeneration. This gameplay effect will use the stamina regeneration delay attribute as a duration, so it will interrupt the regeneration rates for the duration of the effect. Now moving into the final stretch, we need to configure our input handlers. This was covered in a previous video, so it should be familiar by now. This handler is connected to the primary action that was already set to the mapping context. It uses the activate ability by tags as the parent class, and its ability tags match the one set in the primary ability. The next input handler is very similar. The only differences are the gameplay tag used for the ability activation and the input action. Now we are finally ready to test our setup. So if I press play and click my left mouse button, I'll perform the primary attack. Since the ability has debug enabled, I could also see the line traces. Now if I set the slow-mo to 0.5, you should be able to see the attack trails as well. There you go. Now I will revert back to the original speed, and let's test the secondary ability. This time I'm doing box sweeps, and they are matching the shield's shape pretty well, but if they weren't, I could set a slow-mo again and fine-tune the dimensions. One last thing to notice is the stamina consumption. As I attack, it goes down and it takes a little while to come back up. This is using stamina regen rate and delay attributes. To wrap this up, I'll just disable debug from both abilities and make sure that everything looks fine. Everything looks good. This is a wrap for this video. In the next one, we'll go through the hit reactions. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.